I was intrigued by your CV and your areas of interest. And one of them is the intersection between spirituality and psychology. And in 2019, a Jesuit father from New York came to South Africa to give a series of lectures on the following topic: how to live a happy life, the spirituality and psychology of well-being. You interviewed him at the time. Which insights did you gain?
Wow. It was a very interesting time when he was here in South Africa. He's a university professor, which I found very interesting because he lives in that sort of cutthroat world of competition. And yet there was a complete freedom about him. And so one of the things I remember jumping out for me was, to live authentically and to live spiritually, there has to be a freedom. And a lot of the great spiritual mothers and fathers have taught us that, freedom is one of the things that we really need if we're going to live the spiritual life well. Freedom to accept and freedom also to respond to whatever it is we're being asked to respond. I think another thing which he really, the message came home strongly was, we so often think that we can find resources outside of ourselves, for living life or for whatever it is that we need. And his message was, no, we have a resource within ourselves, and we very often go looking outside for what we already have. And for some reason, we never think of going into ourselves to look, first of all, for a resource there for living the spiritual life. I think as well that intersection between psychology and spirituality is very interesting because, at one point, the two were separated out. And even in the academic world, they wouldn't have spirituality anywhere near psychology. Now that's all shifted. Now they're saying, well, actually, we're partners, we need each other. And how, in as much as we can understand the human being from our psychological theories and so forth, there remains a part of us or part of the human person that is always a mystery.
Yes.
And I think psychology gives us the framework for looking at behaviors and attitudes and understanding certain processes and things. And yet, spirituality brings the other part where psychology lacks, and that's the mystery of the human being. And I think he highlighted that for me as well, that even though we can use things like psychology, and we should, I think it's very important, never let go of the fact that there is in every person as well a certain mystery. And I found that beautiful, that even us talking to each other here, there's a mystery within you, there's a mystery within me. And we can name that mystery God or whatever we want, but there's always that something more. And which I think if we're on a journey, we're also always discovering within ourselves if we're paying attention, if we're being attentive to that mystery.
Being attentive, paying attention, that's actually the operative word, because not everybody becomes self-aware, unfortunately so.
No, and I think, I noticed that with some of the older Jesuits I've lived with. I think there's two ways of getting old in a way, The one is I noticed this wonderful letting go and freedom and, in English we say mellowing, where they just become such genuine, such honest people to be with. And then I've lived with one or two men who have passed away who have become bitter and they're angry with life and they look back and they're dissatisfied. They haven't been able to let go of the hurts of the past or the wounds. They haven't given, I think, maybe the necessary attention or being attentive to the things that were important. Whereas on the other side, those who let go, it seems like their attention has been in the right place and it's helped them to let go and to live with a greater freedom. People who mellow well, it seems to me, also become very free and And I look at some of them and think, I hope one day when I am 85, I can be as flexible and as free and as merciful as this fellow is.
One other area of interest of yours is caring for vulnerable persons. Please tell me more about that.
So in the last 25 years, in the Catholic Church specifically, but in churches generally, we have had these terrible exposés of the abuse of young people and vulnerable people by our clergy, by our ministers. And the church set up structures, and we had to they had to appoint people in various places to do that, to oversee that work and to train people and so forth. And so I was involved in that early on from 15, 20 years ago. And so it started off making sure that we had structures in place to safeguard children who were in church schools, in our communities, who were coming for Sunday school, in areas like that. But for me, it became a much bigger thing, because then I started to notice, people can be abused. Vulnerable people could be someone who's going through a terrible emotional time, and they come to see a minister and they get told, something like, oh, well, what have you done wrong that this has happened to you? And that for me is abusive, because I don't believe in that kind of God. So vulnerable people, I expanded, or I've tried to expand that not just to children, but anybody, people who are disabled, people who find themselves in a very fragile state in life, and saying these are the kinds of people that Jesus was specifically interested in. And old people fit into that too, because I think many old people are vulnerable. They are at the mercy sometimes of their families or of care facilities. And so that's been important for me, is to say we need to pay special attention to those people who can easily be used and abused, by people who have power. And sadly, sometimes I've noticed during the funerals of older people that even at times in families a certain amount of abuse takes place, and this can be conflict over who gets the financial resources of the person who's passed away, how the person should be treated, etc., etc. Decisions need to be made when people, for example, are really sickly and they're elderly, as to what they're going to do, what kind of care they're going to be given. Is it going to be palliative care? And so for me, that all fits under this banner of vulnerable people that we need to pay special attention to, because it seems to me that's where Jesus always was, where vulnerable people were. He was happy to reach out to anybody, but the poor in a physical way, but the poor also of spirit, the poor who could be vulnerable people, emotionally poor, they had a special place in Jesus' heart, and they need to be part of our concern if we're going to be good disciples of Jesus.
I also gather from your writing that you are socio-politically conscious. What role does your belief system / spirituality play in that?
It fuels it. For me, that's very important. I think our faith demands of us that we work for a better world, and therefore my faith, my relationship with the Lord means that I need to make sure, where I can, that things are done justly. And I look at the Old Testament and some of the prophets especially, who were very much on the side of the poor, and I'm using poor in the broadest definition possible. And I think that is our role, that the cross has got that vertical beam. It's about my relationship with God. But the cross has also got that horizontal beam. It's about my relationship with others. And I can't be in right relationship with God if I'm not in right relationship with others. On a personal level, but also in terms of community or on a corporate level. I cannot not be concerned about other people and their plight if I am going to be a faithful disciple of Jesus. And so I think my faith has very much fueled a lot of my social concerns. And sometimes the injustice that I've seen within the church community has also fueled some of my justice concerns as well, which always spills out into society, because people in the church are not some special class. We come from society, and so what you find in society, you're also going to find within our church communities, and so there's a relationship between that as well. So very much my spirituality, I think, I strive to live a faith that does justice.
You're also quite outspoken about several issues. Please tell me more about that aspect of your personality.
So I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, and I tend to want to set the world right. And so often when I notice things that are not as they should be, I want to say something. I want to jump on it. And I've done that in the social political spectrum here in this country. I've worked with many different bodies to speak out against things like corruption, things like the abuse of human rights. We have the sad history where we come from a system which oppressed people, but we're back in a place now where people are being oppressed in other ways. And I don't think we can keep quiet. I think we need to speak out about that. Once again, I think gender-based violence in this country is something I've spoken out about a number of times. And even within the church community, because sometimes in our churches, we have a theology that can almost be used to support gender-based violence. We need to be very careful about the way we talk about God and the language that we use. I think another thing for me has been the question, Christianity or religion has always got this uncomfortable relationship with sexuality. And so, issues around the LGBTIQ community, I've spoken out about things like that. Because I think, the scriptures tell us that everybody's made in the image and likeness of God. So every human being has dignity.
Yes.
And that has to be our starting point. And if we can't start there, we don't have a very firm foundation. And so when anyone is not afforded their dignity, their basic human dignity, I think we need to speak out about that.
I'd like to ask you about an article you wrote about the Apostles' Creed and a specific phrase in the Apostles' Creed, descending. He descended into hell. But my question is not a theological one as such, but more, how do you think the death and resurrection of Jesus relates to the human condition?
That's a huge question. I think the pattern of our lives, if we look at it and we are attentive and conscious, is one of passion, death, and resurrection. I somehow get the feeling that we all go through that in one way or another. People may name it in different ways, suffering, why did this happen to me? But I think that is the dynamic of every human life. And that image for me in the creed of Jesus descending into hell, it became an important one, because I think that if we are going to talk about, the passion and the dying and the rising in our own lives, we tend to always want to see God in the wonderful things and the beautiful things. We ask the question when something terrible happens, where is God? As if God is absent. And that image for me was one to say, you know what, in the suffering of our own lives, in the loss of children, in, terrible accidents where people lose their lives, when people have lost their lives to crime, and we want to ask that question, where is God? Well, Jesus, if he descended into hell, which is the emptiest place for any human being to go, he's not out there somewhere, but he is there with us in our suffering, because I really believe in an incarnate God in the person of Jesus. And so for me, that image is important to say, it's not the question of where is God in my suffering, but how is God with me in my suffering? You know? And if God is with me in my suffering, I will also see God with me in my resurrection. You know, we go through things. You know, you lose a child if someone's lost a child, which is a terrible experience for any parent. You know, it rips people's hearts apart, and it's almost like living in hell. And there's a deep suffering, and you know, people slowly move on, and they begin to maybe see little signs of hope. And those are the signs of resurrection. But Jesus was there all the time. God has been there all the time. And so that's why I think that image is so important for me, because it relates to that dynamic of Jesus in our own lives.
How do you, Russell, deal with pain, suffering, and loss in your own life?
I lost my brother in 2007. It was a big shock. He took his own life. And for a long time, I didn't allow myself to feel anything. You know, for 5-6 years maybe, I didn't allow myself to feel anything. And then I asked those where questions. And now I have a public face as a minister, and I also had to deal with this loss. I think I got to a point where I said, actually, I have to start to feel and allow myself to feel. I then learned that I need to talk about it. You know, I need to find places and spaces. And it was to older people that I went to talk about it.
Really?
Yeah. I then needed to talk to God about it. You know? And I think the real important thing for me in dealing with suffering was not to be afraid to, you know, people always walk on shells when they're around you. They don't want to mention it, but not to be afraid myself to talk about it and to engage with people then once I had a chance to reflect on it. So I think for me, the way I deal with suffering is my first tendency would be, oh, I'm the victim of all this. But is to step back and to say, okay, I need space and time to reflect. And I also need to find a spiritual anchor, you know, which can sometimes be a spiritual practice, which can sometimes, you know, just be the sort of way that I pray that helps me to begin to deal with it. And I've also found therapy very helpful in my own life as well, to help me to face up to some of these things, to some of these sufferings. And I guess I've got to a space where I'm also comfortable simply just to live with it. I have this wonderful image in John's Gospel in chapter 5. You know, there's a man lying on a mat for 38 years, and Jesus comes along, and he heals this man. He says to him, you know, get up and go. And he picks up his mat and he walks. And I always just think to myself, well, you know, if you've been lying on that mat for 38 years, why do you pick up the mat and walk with it? And one day it suddenly occurred to me, it's an image of our woundedness. You know, the wound almost controlled him for 38 years. When he stands up and carries that mat, the wound is still with him. The mat reminds him of that wound. And the wound will always be with him. But he's no longer controlled by that wound. And so I don't want those things, those sufferings in my life to control me. I want to be aware of them and I want to live with them, but I don't want to allow them to be the center of my life. And suddenly in that gospel passage, I sort of realized there's a movement that needs to take place. The wounds will never go away. Maybe some sufferings we live with forever. But it's what's the power of that? How much power do we give that suffering over us? And I believe in faith that we can move towards some sort of healing. Not to pretend it's not there, but a healing that is integrated. And a healing that means I don't forget, but I'm able to move forward.
From everything that you've said now, I'm hearing this phrase, spiritual direction, which has become sort of a catchphrase recently, but it's part of what you do. If you can describe spiritual direction to me as a layperson in maybe 2 or 3 sentences, what would that be?
The key question in spiritual direction is, what and where am I finding God in my life? And what is God inviting me to? And that for me is at the core of spiritual direction. What we do is we meet with someone who's trained to help us to reflect on those questions and to see where God is and what God is inviting me to do. And that means bringing my whole life there, because God can be inviting me in my suffering, in my happiness, in my joys, in my struggles. So that for me would be spiritual direction 101.
What is your understanding, Russell, of life beyond the grave, life after death?
It's a life with God. So, and people will say, well, how can you say that, because isn't God here now? But I think it's a life where we live more fully in the presence of God. We can so easily forget God's presence in our daily lives now, but it seems to me, or I imagine it as a life where we are constantly conscious of the generosity, the love, the mercy, the goodness of God. And so we live in a place where I would say our spirits feel nourished and fed as fully as they can be when we are beyond the grave. So for me, that's always the image that I hold on to, of this enjoying the fullness of God's presence. And I think if I had to put it to an image to imagine, it would be, this vast, beautiful ocean on a nice sunny day, and it's living in that wonderful space and being conscious of being in that wonderful space. Which we're not always in this life. Yeah.
Do you think you have absolute answers to all the big questions of life? Do you have life all figured out?
Absolutely not. Maybe when I was younger, I thought I had life all figured out. But I've suddenly realized that, there are very few, if any, absolutes in this life. And I think that if we live thinking we have absolutes, we could land up being the bitter people, because those absolutes don't turn out to be, people, I want to get married, I want to have children, I'm going to have this happy family, and that doesn't happen for one reason or another, or a relationship breaks down and the absolute is shattered. So I think we have to be very careful about absolutes. I think that I would replace the word absolute with adventure, that we have lots of adventures perhaps that we want to go on, but absolutes, I think, can set us up for a lot of disappointments. And I also think that sometimes absolutes, we hold on to absolutes, and it's almost like we are deceiving ourselves that we can attain those, and we can't, because life and the tilted structures of life have ways of knocking us that we're not always, we don't even see that coming at times.
Russell Pollitt, what lies ahead for you? How do you plan on making the most of the rest of your life?
I want to be more open to whatever comes to me. And so part of me says, when I hear you ask that question, I don't want to have a plan. I want to be open to and generous to whatever comes to me. I want to embrace life as fully as I possibly can. And I think I want to grow in being faithful to myself, to who I am, and also faithful to God and the people around me. And that at times is very challenging to do, because there's so many different things at play. But if I can live with that freedom and that openness, St. Ignatius in his spiritual exercises, which he leaves us and which many people still do today, right at the beginning, he talks about not desiring a long life or a short life, not desiring health or sickness, not desiring riches or poverty, but just being free to receive what comes. If I can live just half of that for the rest of my life, I think I'd be pretty much living the plan, if we want to call it that. And I think I also want to I want to learn to let go. That's become a big theme for me in my life in the last little while, to let go of, past hurts, to let go of things that have not served me well, so that I am free to embrace the things that might serve me well in the future, and to just to follow that lead. I mean, you have little plans. I want to finish a book, and I want to do that. But I think in the bigger, to live with meaning, to live my life with meaning, would be for me what would be important, and therefore I need to be attentive to what's going to help me to do that.
We hope you enjoyed episode 2. Should you wish to further reflect on this interview, you can download notes from our website www.invia.org.za.